Seems like it was only yesterday in August of 2022 when I was still living in Australia and I rushed out to get my hands on Tom Bower's much coveted and anticipated book, Revenge. At the time, Meghan and Harry were still riding on the coattails of their infamy, still benefiting from the royal luster. But all good things come to an end. And here we are, 4 years later, new book, same old problems. By the way, before we go any further, I do want to let you know that we've covered all 3 excerpts that were released in anticipation of the publication of Tom Bower's newest book, Betrayal. And so we won't be rehashing whatever we've covered in those excerpts, namely Paris Fashion Week revelations and the Sente Ballet scandal. So if you'd like to hear the coverage of these topics, please do make sure you check out the 2 videos before this one. What made Revenge so special is the fact that it covered so much of Meghan's life pre-Harry. Things she didn't want us to know, things she tried everything in her power to suppress, going as far as cutting out virtually everyone from her life before Harry, barring her so-called best friend who didn't even feature as a bridesmaid, and of course, her mother. Betrayal, on the other hand, hits a bit different, where Revenge had a lot of room for revelations to be made, thanks to Meghan's anonymity before meeting Harry and her dishonesty about her past. Betrayal rehashes past events and covers things that people such as myself and even you in the audience are likely already aware of, simply because Meghan and Harry have given us no choice. The media headlines should be listed in their tax filings as their primary place of residence. But what Betrayal does do very well, other than discussing, of course, the main theme of the book being Meghan and Harry's betrayal of their own families and their country, well, in Harry's case, his country and the monarchy, is tracking the Sussexes' rise and fall. From the magical aura of the royal wedding, when they were both on top of the world, to being reduced, effectively, to floating about aimlessly, trying to cling on to something, anything, only to fail and get swept off in an unforgiving current that is beyond their control. Apart from chapter 1, which details the One Young World speech fiasco from back in September of 2022, which we did cover in the excerpts, part 1, I believe, the first 13 chapters of the book are a rehashing of Meghan's start in the public eye. Tom Bower also seems to have gathered and included a lot more information that I remember reading from both Courtiers by Valentine Lowe and, of course, Harry's own book, Spare. So to me, as someone who's read these books, these chapters, I do have to say, were a bit of a drag to get through because they were very repetitive. But if you haven't read either of these books, or if you don't remember what they contained, then maybe you'd find these chapters a lot more insightful than I did. Nevertheless, in summary, Meghan, as we all know, was a nightmare for palace staff to work for very early on. Senior officials saw from the very beginning that Meghan was loyal to no one but herself and saw herself at the center of every situation, which is, of course, problematic in any circumstance, let alone a monarchy, where everyone's role is to support the reigning monarch. Before the wedding, she was told in uncompromising terms the deal for marrying into the royal family, recalled an official. She began crossing red lines, and still they let her marry into the royal family. This is, of course, in addition to the bullying allegations, which seem to dog Meghan everywhere she goes. One thing I personally don't understand, and likely never will, is why Meghan was allowed to get away with this behavior, despite being reprimanded by William, as we know, despite being reprimanded by the late Queen herself, with the most famous incident being the food tasting before Meghan's wedding, where she scolded a chef for apparently putting egg in a vegan dish She said she tasted it, there was no egg, and the Queen reprimanded her. Then we learned from this book, I don't believe I've come across this incident before. The Queen once chose to drive across the Windsor estate to Frogmore, so this is after the wedding, to tell Meghan off for insulting a sub-gardener. But anyone who's read Courtiers, or if you've watched my video from a couple of years ago called The Monster, would know that the palace basically enabled Meghan's bullying by choosing to do nothing about it. Tom Bower confirms this. In chapter 8, he wrote about how Edward Young, the Queen's private secretary, along with the now King Charles's private secretary and William's private secretary, had discussed Jason Kanoff's complaints about Meghan's mistreatment of her staff, but had done absolutely nothing. Meghan's staff remained unprotected, and she had not been formally advised to control her behavior. All three had obeyed their bosses, the Queen, Charles, and William. Nothing, the three had decided, should be done to further inflame the Sussexes. This was the response they were used to, being a non-response. No wonder Meghan and Harry have been emboldened for so long to act out and cause trouble as though there are no consequences, because to them, as far as they're concerned, at least until recently, there have been no consequences. I know some people have a problem with being confrontational and prefer to take the more peaceful route, but turning a blind eye to preserve the peace with problematic people never works. Just ask the palace what they think of this little picture of a certain Andrew Mountbatten Windsor in the back of a police car after being arrested.
I don't sweat.
Like we covered in the first excerpt, and like Harry has made abundantly clear in Spare, and I suppose also in the Harry and Meghan docuseries, if you want to call it a docuseries on Netflix, we know that a particular hobby of theirs is to target Catherine, Princess of Wales in particular, whom Tom Bower writes Harry had described as competitive by nature, of being jealous and feeling threatened by Meghan, fearing that the latter had the edge in both style and modernity. Yes, because statuesque Catherine, who dresses impeccably 9 times out of 10 and has the benefit of the best milliners and tailors and stylists in the world working for her, is threatened by the edge of getting swallowed alive by wrinkled linen. Kate had not appreciated a streetwise, self-confident rival. Clever and stylish, Meghan was clearly unwilling to obediently serve the British people as a member of the royal team. As Meghan would later tell the tennis champion Serena Williams, the royal family hates ambition. That was associated with vulgar pushiness. I believe my last video right before this one covered this entire topic. How Meghan confuses her evil vindictiveness, her entitlement, and her unbridled narcissism for ambition, thereby giving the word, which should be positive, a negative twist. Now we all know that Meghan Markle lives for those Diana comparisons. So much so that she's practically spent the last 10 years trying to engineer such moments, which isn't creepy at all. But I do wonder whether even for her there is a line to be crossed when it comes to those comparisons, because Tom Bower writes, like Meghan, Diana enjoyed casting herself alternately as the victim and the rebel, while at the same time using the media to attack Charles. At the time of Diana's death in 1997, the establishment was grappling with an existential problem: how to protect the 1,000-year institution from her sabotage. In 2019, palace officials realized that Meghan posed the same threat. The rest of the chapters in what I have deemed Act 1. It's not officially Act 1, it's just for the purposes of this video. The book is not categorized in that way. Cover Megxit, their very brief time in Vancouver, the several multi-million-dollar deals that they signed with Netflix, Spotify, and Penguin Random House, and the beginning of the end for them, now we can say in hindsight, the Oprah interview. But all of that is very old news, which I will not be boring you with. What matters is that by early 2021, Meghan and Harry, having spooked the palace sufficiently, had every reason to believe they were a protected golden couple with the world at their feet. Neither would be familiar with the witch's warning at the opening of Macbeth. Shall he dwindle, peak and pine? Those at the top rarely have the foresight to imagine their irreversible decline. Clearly, Meghan and Harry believed that Megxit would be a hit. The palace, other than Meghan, did have some reason to worry. To illustrate, in 1983, the monarchy's popularity was at a whopping 86%, which, when compared to much more recent approval ratings, signals a problem. Younger people in particular aren't all that interested in preserving a monarchy and instead favor the concept of electing a head of state. So when you combine that reality with the palace's belief at the time that Meghan and Harry were dangerous, one can see how they were left feeling vulnerable. But hindsight is 20/20, as they say, and let's face it, the palace and the royal family barely got to know Meghan. She was there for all of 2 minutes? So they never really got to understand what we can all clearly see today, which is that Meghan and Harry are truly the definition of all talk and zero, zilch, nada, walk. Blinded by their own hubris, freshly Megxited, they made a gross miscalculation. The one common thread with practically all of Meghan and Harry's woes is the fact that they think that their mere existence warrants them getting paid millions, if not billions, and that talent and hard work is strictly in the domain of us lesser mortals. And Tom Bower illustrates this quite well in chapters 14 to 26, where he charts the Sussexes' very brief trajectory to failure in Hollywood, or should I say, their failure to launch. The Oprah interview was one of their first and one of the most fatal of these miscalculations, because they showed the world that A, they were liars who were not to be trusted, and B, that they would stop at nothing, including betraying their own kin to get ahead themselves. In his book, Tom reminds us that while this strategy seemed to have worked initially, even leading to that laughingstock Ripple of Hope Award for standing up against the racism that never happened, by Harry and Meghan's own admission no less, behind the scenes, Hollywood heavy-hitters already started distancing themselves from the couple. And for obvious reasons. I mean, if you're willing to betray your family, then what is it that you aren't willing to do? Speaking of the Ripple of Hope Award, did you know that some people, according to Tom, paid $410,000 US for the privilege of meeting Harry and Meghan at the gala that they went to? Contrast that with the, roughly $2,000 US people have to pay to see Meghan at a Sydney resort where apparently human feces is washing up, and that gives you a really good idea of how far they've fallen. But I'm getting ahead of myself. What Tom does really well in this part of the book is he shows how Harry and Meghan live in their own bubble, thereby never learning from criticism. They take note of it, they clap back, but they never learn. He writes about how they pressed on with this familiar pattern, this same strategy of airing their dirty laundry in exchange for money and attention, despite, we learn in chapter 15 of the book, being warned by an unnamed family member during the Queen's Platinum Jubilee in 2022 that if a book were to be published in the Queen's lifetime, or if footage from the Jubilee were to feature on Netflix, there would be no way back. Now let's remember, they obviously didn't know back in June of 2022 that the late Queen would pass away a mere few months later in September, which means that they didn't care. Despite seeing how frail and sick and weak the Queen was in June of 2022, surely they must have known she didn't have long. They pressed on anyway. The Netflix series did break records. It did very well. But just as with the Oprah interview before it, good numbers don't necessarily translate to goodwill. Apart from a minority of supporters, the series only served to further diminish what little integrity and credibility Meghan and Harry enjoyed by the end of 2022. The reaction to Spare, as Tom chronicled it, was almost identical. The ghostwriter deliberately wrote the book in the style of gonzo journalism, where the truth is irrelevant and the author's subjective point of view replaced it. And while it too enjoyed great numbers, I think it was the best-selling nonfiction book at the time. As someone who did read the book and reviewed it on this channel, believe me when I tell you it was nothing short of an exercise in self-torture. So I thoroughly, for one, have to disagree with Mr. Bauer when he described the book as a gripping page-turner, unless he was being sarcastic. I know you Brits love sarcasm. But while the numbers were good, the reaction to it was overwhelmingly dismal, ranging from derision to disgust. And unsurprisingly, Harry and Meghan's popularity continued to plummet. Tom even reveals private reactions from Harry's former friends after he had the gall to ask them what they thought. "I'm staggered by your disloyalty," emailed one of his oldest friends. "You're cruel and cowardly," wrote another. The father of one close friend also emailed his dismay to Harry. In a not so surprising revelation, Harry was supposedly also a nightmare to work with everyone from the writer to the photographer for the cover photo complaining about him. In the same vein, Meghan's battles with the staff over at Spotify while working on archetypes were quite bad and only suppressed because of those pesky NDAs.
The near catastrophic event.
Oh, I don't think that's true. I think that's all, exaggerated and stuff like that.
Fast forward a couple of months to May 2023, and we find ourselves smiling in the back of a New York cab during the catastrophic car chase that never was. Does anyone even remember the name of the event that Meghan attended, where she was honored with an award that I also don't remember the name of? Yeah. Neither do I, and that's exactly the point Tom Bauer makes. Rather than attracting the attention that the organizers of that event so desperately wanted and hoped for by associating themselves with a megastar like Meghan, Harry and Meghan's New York shenanigans, which yet again recollections may vary, their version did not accord with that of the mayor and the police, had the exact opposite effect. Rather than bring attention to the event, the entire thing got buried under headlines of the chase. What was meant to be an attempt to not only dominate headlines, but secure security, that is so bad, but win back security over in the UK, which also, surprise, surprise, did not end up working. They instead ended up getting humiliated and practically called out as liars. And when you add that to the fact that apparently even Kamala Harris and her people wanted nothing to do with Meghan and Harry once Meghan tried to cozy up to them, and Travelist CEO Sally Davy trying to eradicate Harry from Travelist's rebranding, despite Harry being the founder, the message becomes very clear. Associate with Meghan and Harry at your own peril. By the summer of 2023, Meghan and Harry's approval ratings among Americans had fallen to about 25%. After washing their linen in public, the Sussexes were no longer revered royals, but merely common celebrities. After the failure of Meghan's abysmal flopcast archetypes, leading to the humiliating comments from Bill Simmons after the contract was cancelled, the tension in the Montecito mansion was hysterical. Harry fell to pieces, according to one eyewitness. Meghan was distraught, but eventually she could process the rejection. Outwardly, Netflix maintained its staunch support of the couple. But even as far back as the summer of 2023, an insider, Tom reveals, conclusively pronounced that the lemon has been fully squeezed. The Netflix series and Harry's book had not sunk the Windsors. Americans remained fascinated by the royal family. The once adored couple were now struggling to fill up stadiums for the Invictus Games, which in 2023, more than ever before, had well and truly been transformed into the Meghan Markle fashion show, during which not only would she change her clothes multiple times a day, but would also make her publicists brief the press about the incredibly overpriced and inappropriate items, considering the setting, that apparently pass for fashion. According to Tom's sources, even Harry had become exasperated with her limelight-stealing ways, going as far as impatiently asking her to leave after she stole the show yet again at the Nigerian volleyball game in Dusseldorf in 2023. Speaking of stealing the limelight, Tom also does an excellent job of demonstrating Harry and Meghan's obsession, which started when they were still within the royal fold, with stalking the royal family's calendar and making it almost a full-time job to try to do things by either releasing photos on social media, dominating headlines, or staging pop shots, all in an effort to outshine the royal family and the good that they are doing. We also get confirmation, not that we needed it, that just as she did with finding freebies, Meghan did indeed brief Omid Scobie on Endgame, attacking Catherine in particular, a dangerous move which Tom Bauer wrote was their last throw of the dice. Scobie's editors assumed that the stuff on Kate, phrases like Katie Keene, and the revelation she was cosplaying Diana came from Meghan. One shocking allegation about the racist royals was also sourced by the editors from the Duchess. But rather than turn people against the royal family, Endgame, Tom writes, had sealed the Sussexes' fate. Scobie's lies, which notoriously included naming Catherine and the king as the alleged royal racists, had fueled a crisis of trust in the Sussexes' brand. The kickback also damaged Archewell and the amount of donations coming its way. And we know this is true because Archewell has been performing so dismally that it eventually had to be wound up late last year, being replaced with a much smaller entity, Archewell Philanthropies. This also lends credibility to Dr. Chandauka from Santebale's allegations that Harry and Meghan have become a toxic brand, which has caused Santebale to experience a drop in donations.
When?
By 2024, Prince Harry in particular, Tom writes, was spiraling. His self-imposed exile and the consequences of betraying his family, monarchy, and country were starting to take their toll. Especially after being sidelined in both the Nigerian and Colombian full royal tours, Harry had finally started to realize that, as far as being the spare, he had hopped from the royal family frying pan into the Montecito inferno. As Tom Bauer put it, the prince had become a background noise, a non-essential non-entity. And it was this realization, Tom writes, that kickstarted Harry's new solo philanthropic prince era. After witnessing Meghan's attempts to make it on her own, Harry had somewhat of a wake-up call, and he decided to revert to what he did best during his days as a working royal. Except he quickly learned that without the help of the men in grey suits, he wasn't even any good at that. He'd all but abandoned Santebale and only tried to wrangle it back out of Sophie Chandauka's hands when he'd realized she meant business and wanted to change things up. And then when he couldn't take it back, he threw a hissy fit and tried to stage a coup to oust her, which included dirty tactics such as rerouting or stealing, I should say, potential donors of Santebales to donate to Archewell and Travelist instead. The African Parks Ranger scandal, which was also written about in this book, was all but ignored by Harry, leading it to become yet another major PR disaster for the couple. We also learned that Netflix really only quote-unquote partnered with Meghan because she was really struggling to find an investor or even a CEO to head her business, presumably because of her toxic image and reputation. And so she had effectively begged Netflix to bail her out, only for them to unceremoniously ditch her earlier this year. Tom also covers the Andrew fiasco and how clearly it's showing that when it comes to Prince William, who according to Tom's book is pulling all the strings behind the scenes, he isn't taking any prisoners. And that definitely has Meghan and Harry on edge. To close off, Tom Bower included a quote from a New York columnist, Robert Hay, which I think sums up the couple's reward for their endless betrayals quite perfectly. They took a dramatic turn to the dark side. There's a money grab. She seems more transactional now. In the long term, she couldn't handle it. They failed in America. And that, my friends, brings us to the end of this review/summary of Tom Bower's latest book, Betrayal. I do have some cons I would like to share. There were too many silly typos. When you're working alone, when you're self-published, that's understandable. Still really cringe, but given limited resources, understandable. But when you have an entire team behind you, I, for one, don't like it. It just takes away from the experience of reading, especially when the typos or mistakes are quite obvious. There were also a couple of events that Tom had recalled incorrectly. For example, Meghan being with Harry in London for the Well Child Awards in July of 2021, when he was allegedly chased by paparazzi. Meghan was not there. Meghan had not set foot in the UK until the Platinum Jubilee of 2022. As I mentioned at the start of this video, I found the first 13 or so chapters boring and repetitive because they basically rehashed things that Tom had already covered in Revenge. Spare was also rehashed quite a bit. I pretty much called chapter 4 in my notes Spare 2.0. And finally, he keeps referring to Meghan critics as trolls. I don't know if he's just using that term because that's the term Meghan and Harry use, but in at least one sentence, it seemed as though it was the term he thought was acceptable, which is not fair to people who fairly critique Meghan and Harry and who are not trolls in the slightest. Other than that, it did a great job of showing the terribly toxic nightmare that Meghan and Harry are stuck in and honestly likely will always be stuck in for as long as they live. This endless stream of own goals, endless miscalculations that almost always end up backfiring in their faces. That's all I have for you today. I hope you enjoyed this review/summary. I did try my best. It took me 5 days to read this book. I have a hectic schedule and I can only film on Sundays. So not fun, but hopefully worth it. Do let me know if you've purchased the book as well and what you thought of it. Also, if you appreciate the work that I do on this channel, do consider visiting the link to Patreon in the description box. It's primarily ad-free versions of the videos that you find here, and sometimes, when time allows, bonus or exclusive content. I will not lie to you though, ever since my move to Japan, life has been really non-stop. So treat it as a tip jar if you think it's worth it, as a thank you for the hours that I pour in to keep this channel alive and well. Thank you so much for tuning in. I'll catch you in the next one. Bye. Tracking the Sussexes.